Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. It's my honor to be here, and thank you for the organizer to invite me. Also, thank you very much for the Confucian Institute to help me to get the visa in time. I think today I will try to give some information about the new type of urbanization and the new national plan for the urbanization from 2014 to 2020. Yesterday morning, Professor François Gibelou gave a very brief introduction about URBACHINA project. I'm the member of the research team. I enjoy this project very much because I can get a lot of new information, new thinking, and some new research results about future urbanization in China. So the end of this May, we have a workshop in Chongqing. And during the workshop, one lady from the London School of Economics gave the book written by the Peter Hall. The name is Good City, Better Lives. I think the book is mentioned 5 basic challenges, well, I listed here, because the time is very limited, so I don't want to read all of 5 challenges. This book is very, very, very valuable for us because they talk about some challenges in European country. And, but these 5 challenges, I think they talk about economic development in the urban area, talk about the house or home, and talk about the transportation and the land use, talk about the resources and the environmental and climate change issues. And the last one is about financing and some governance. So I think these several challenges is also we face today and also tomorrow. So I think the new national plan for the urbanization is a very long file. Maybe the totally is 30,000 characters. So how can I present the plan? So based on this challenge, maybe I try to organize my presentation into the 6 aspects. The first one is the population. We will answer the question is where the people to go. So free mobility of the population is very important. Second is about the land use. We call in Chinese we call the D. How can we use the utility of the land use? Land can be more effective. And third one is about financing. Maybe in Chinese we call it 钱. Where the money come from? And we should give more multiplex form and financing actor of cities. And the first one is about the industry, how the economic activities in the cities can be developed. So agglomeration of industry and the economic of scale will become the major driving force for the sustainable development of urbanization. The number 5 is about transportation. So maybe the public transportation will play a very important role within and inter-cities. And the other, the 6th aspect is about the resources and the environmental. That is very important for the sustainable development. So following, I will just talk about these 6 aspects for the urbanization. Firstly, I will give a very brief introduction about achievements of urbanization in China. That is the urbanization, I think maybe in 1978, the urbanization rate only less than 18%, but now is almost 54%. And the urbanization is very rapidly in China. But if we compare with other countries, we can see the changes, the urbanization rates have been lower than the countries such as Japan and South Korea compatible stage of the development. We can see the other side. The first one is South Korea in 1960 to 1990, and the third one is Japan in 1950 to 1980. So compared with these two countries, I think China is not faster than these two countries. And also this is from the other book. I think maybe the information here, we also use some result from the new book. That is our P.R.C. work with World Bank have the new book about urbanization in China. In this book, they talk about China have avoided some common year of the urbanization. Nobody, for example, the urban poverty, unemployment, and squatters. And also, I think the rapid urbanization have facilitated the economic transformation in the last 30 years in China. For example, especially rapid development, economic development was facilitated by the urbanization that create the supportive environmental for growth with a lot of labor force, cheap land, and good infrastructure. So next I will talk about the challenge. I give this very brief background for the challenge. Maybe the following session will about the future target and the policies. So this basic information about challenge can maybe for us to understand why we have some this new policy and the new target. For the population, I think the one challenge is incompleted migration. These two lines, one is population. So the right one is means the population. The definition is based on the permanent resident. The blue line, the definition is based on the population with the hukou. So we can see in 2012, the urbanization rate of the permanent population is almost 53%. But it's a population with hukou, the urbanization rate only the 35%. So there's a big difference. The other is the P.R.C. and the World Bank. The book also showed that only the 20% of rural migrants move to the urban city area with their whole family. But from the survey, maybe half of the migrants want to settle down the whole in the city. So it's not all of migrants can move to the city with their whole family. And the other is rural migrants. It's difficult to integrate into the urban life. One maybe is because the hukou system. Because in China, many the public services, the education, the resources of public services based on the 户口 system. The other problem is the education and the training of the migrants cannot match their job opportunities. For land use, I think maybe we also have some challenge. One is for the last several years, the land urbanization faster than the population urbanization. For example, from the 2000 to 2011, the area of the urban built-up area increased by the 76%, but the population rate only the 50%. And some estimates also show that the average population density in China cities have dropped by more than 25% in the last decades. This also from the P.R.C and World Bank book. It's just to show the land use is not compact. They compare with some European city and Japan and China. These two is Pudong and some Beijing, and we can see the land use is not very effective. This also shows that if Guangzhou, their density profile can be same as the soil, maybe Guangzhou could accommodate 4 million more people. So I think in Guangzhou, the land use is much less effective than the soil. For financing, the challenge one is the local government debt. This figure shows that there is a very huge local government debt. The other is the investor in the urban infrastructure almost is very relatively unitary. The private agency participation is very, very low. For the industry, we think the economic agglomeration risk is very low. If we compare with United States, the top 10 metropolitan area in United States account for the 38% of GDP. But China, only the top 10 metropolitan area, only the 19% of GDP. So the problem is for the industrial development foundation in urban area is not very stable, especially the investment in the urban area is too much over-relying on the investment, especially in the real estate investment. So, and the other is services. Industry development is relatively lagging. For the transportation, one problem is the motorization and urbanization have stepped into the rapid development stage. I think these show one is a private motor vehicle increased very rapidly, especially after the 2003. And so the transportation congestion in mega city and big city, even some middle-sized city, is very seriously. for the resources and the environment, we have a lot of problem. For example, in China, much of China's pollution is concentrated in the cities. So I think the pollution is maybe is very seriously and is very bad for the health and the well-being. And I think maybe these 2 days, many people talk about the pollution problem, and that is to show the total particulates, the matter in the major cities. I think maybe the Shanghai, Beijing, and Tianjin is very high, but little bit lower than Delhi and Cairo, but it's higher than most of the cities in the world. And the problem also the resources, especially the water resources. The water scarcity and quality are the major problem for the sustainable urban development in China. Just now I talk about some challenge in the 6th aspect. So the following I will talk about some new policy based on the national plan for the new type of urbanization since 2014 to 2020. So also in the 6th aspect, one is the population. Maybe target is improve the capacity of agglomeration, and we say where the people will go, and also we try to give the more free mobility of the population, and especially the basic public services equalized and inclusive urbanization development. That is our target. For the where the people will go, maybe in this document, they talk about the city clusters. That is a map show the city clusters. This map, there is 3 vertical line and 2 horizontal line. We can see some green circle is about the national level clusters, include Jing-Jing-Ji, Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei. And this one? No, I don't know how to use. And no, sorry. And Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta. And the other is middle stream of Yangtze River city clusters. And the other is Chongqing, Chengdu city cluster. This 5 city cluster is a national level. The rest of circle is the regional city clusters. And the other policy is about the CUHK reform and also the public services. I think maybe many people talk about the CUHK system, but my point of view, CUHK system is the management of the people, the population. I think it's very important. But since 1950, usually they link the CUHK system with some resources in shortage. So far, the CUHK is a problem, but behind the CUHK, I think the problem is public services. One is the resources of public services is very limited. The other is public services, the distribution is not equalized between the big city and the small city, between the rural and the urban area, there is a lot of difference. The third one is sometimes the link the allocation of public services with hukou. So I think how can we solve the problem? One is a reform of the hukou. So maybe recently they have new policy, the differentiation of the hukou system. Like in the small, for the township and the small city, maybe we release the hukou system. And for the 500,000 to 1 million the city, maybe the orderly open the hukou system. And for the maybe the big city, the people over the 5 million maybe still try to control the urban population. So the different city, have different policy. And the other is try to provide more public services to the people. And the other is de-link the allocation of public services resources to the people. But it's a step by step. And the other very important for the training and the education, I think they have some very detailed policy to improve the human capital in the cities. For the land use, one is how can we use the land, urban land, is more efficiently, and the other is maybe the optimize the urban industry structure. For the land use, it's very important is reform land management, but this one is very complicated, and we also have a lot of prudent implementation of the reform of a rural land system. For the financing, I think maybe there is a very big problem. So maybe one is establish the diversified sustainable urbanization fund, safeguard mechanism. The other is the physical and the taxation reform. So maybe recently the Ministry of Finance promotes some PPP model, and also maybe the improve the local taxation system. For example, maybe some real estate tax should be timely boost. And also we try to reinforce the power of a local government bond in promoting the urbanization. And the other very important is establish the standard and the transparent urban construct investment and the financing mechanism, because we should prevent the diffuse financial risks. For industry, I think maybe it's very important. That is maybe we can talk about later. One is optimize the structure for industry and promote the transformation of and upgrading the economy. And the other is maybe our studies show that we use the Gini coefficient to show the industrial and the economic agglomeration. We can see the blue line is for the Gini coefficient of GDP across the cities. The green line is for industry, and the red line is for the services. For the industry, we can see maybe since 2005 is a decline, because there is a lot of transformation for industry from coast area to other cities. So we think our policy should is promote reasonable network of industry, construct a platform of industry to transfer and re-undertake. So that is very important for the inland cities. For the transportation, we think maybe it's very important. The target is a low emission and environmental friendly way of the transportation. And also the city-to-city transportation need the urban cluster more efficiently. So I think for this one, maybe we don't have enough time. So I think maybe very important is to promote green transport. Maybe in this document, just to show maybe put the public transportation as the first priority of the urban traffic development. Also, try to manage the regulation of the motor vehicle emission standards. And also for the city plan, maybe before they just pay attention to the some road for the motor vehicles, but maybe recently they say try to establish some safe or continuous space for the walking and for the bicycles. For the resources and the environment, I think there is very important is we use the ecological civilization concept. I don't want to say it in detail. And finally, we think maybe we give some figures. Maybe the World Bank and the DRC, the book, the name is China Urbanization towards the more efficient, inclusive, and sustainable urbanization. From the national plan, they give the target is to the 2020, the urbanization rate of a permanent population will reach about 60%. And the people with hukou, the population can be the 45%. The gap is narrowed down than right now. And from the book of the World Bank and the DRC, they say that maybe in 2030, the urbanization rate can be the 70%. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. This is a very comprehensive analysis of the urban issues that China is facing today, and very important how the national urbanization plan is trying to tackle this issue that I remember has been released just last March 2014. So it's a new season for the urbanization in China. So now, based on this, I would like to open the floor for questions. If you have some questions, please, a couple of questions maybe, because we don't have so much time.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. My question is, since you have presented so many challenges or thematics, does the state of, or does the central government of China has defined some priorities in the future action until 2020?
I think maybe very important is the people. In Chinese way, we call the 以人为本 is translate into English is people central. Yeah, I think maybe all of things maybe just oriented to the people.
More concretely, 在这些主题里面有哪一些主题是比较更重中之重吧？
都重了。
I think we shouldn't move to Chinese because I think half of us cannot understand.
Because I think since the fundings, etc., are very limited, we cannot do so many things at the same time. I mean, what are the priorities?
This plan is not, I think, maybe for the allocation of resources. Maybe I think it's not, some is maybe is give priority for the resources allocation. But it's more important is reform. For example, the CUHK system reform, and I think maybe when the Vice Chairman of NDRC, Xu Xianping, release this national plan, maybe they are not only himself, also some from the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Land and Construction, Ministry of Finance. Maybe they are not all talk about the allocation of resources. Maybe they talk about how they can do some reform. So I think maybe this one is after the 18 after the reform conference. Maybe this one is give very detailed reform implementation for the urbanization. I think maybe that is more important for the investments and some resources allocation.
Okay, thank you.
Time for another question. So one there.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Sharon from the University of Sheffield. I'm very impressed by your slogan that good city, better life. I think you talk a lot about good city's plan. So my question about a better life. Looks at the central government's policies still aim to promote the degree of urbanization.
The better city and no, a good city and a better life is not our topic. It's Peter Hall's topic. Yeah, I think they talk about the better life is the people's live and work and how can they live and work and play.
Yeah, exactly. I think because there is a raising of concern about the decreasing life quality living in Chinese cities like Beijing, Shanghai. I think it's all our concern. But it looks like the central government is still trying to promote the urbanization ratio and trying to, for example, I think you mentioned trying to encourage the free transfer between rural land to urban land and also increase the ability of city agglomeration. This all will give more burden, I think, to the big city. Do our cities really have the capacity to be so big and meanwhile give good life to our citizens? What do you think? Yeah.
Maybe I think for the CUHK reform, we can see the very differential the policy to the different sides of cities. We think about for the big city, the people the size over 5 million population. For this kind of city, maybe so far the problem is resources constraint, like water supply and energy supply, and how can we deal with the some waves. So I think for this kind of city, maybe from the top leader, they also think about how can we control the size of the city. Especially in the Beijing, now they just control the size of a population. So I think maybe most is maybe talk about the migrants, but in fact, it's not only pay attention to the migrants, it's talk about all of population in the city. I think maybe even for the transportation, it's not only the migrants. So I think maybe it's, the plan is maybe now is the problem, more problem is migrants. So maybe there's talk about something more policy for the migrants. But in fact, when the life in the city, I think is not only the migrants, all of the people in the urban area. So
thank you.
Thank you. If you have very, very small questions, short and concise, otherwise we need to move. Maybe just one, the last one.
Well, thank you for your presentation, and I wonder if there anything that you can see as what can be our legacy to based on for the future development, because you were mentioning about this sustainable development, and I'm sure that there have been many things has been sustaining there for 1,000 years, and I don't know if you have any considerations that what could be taken into account, if you would like to share with us. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Maybe that requires a long answer, probably. And
yeah, I think maybe I just talk about the 6 aspects, but in fact, in this document, they also talk about some other, like a culture and house and civilization, and also the governance. So maybe I just answer just say the 6 aspects, but in fact, I think for this document, they think about a lot of long-term issues. But the time is only talk about the 2020, but in fact, I think it's not only this point. Maybe it's there is long-term view. And also, I think recently the new policy also think about some long history of the urban, especially for the culture and other issues.
I would like to thank conference organizer for inviting me to attend this conference. I enjoy a lot. I must confess that I know nothing about future studies, but I learned a lot. It changed my mentality as a social scientist. We should look at future when we study current issues. My talk basically will review the history of city and regional planning and in a comparable sense. Oops. Okay, so planning. In the West, planning didn't have a good name. Planning often regarded as enemy of business. In UK, people described planning is under the neoliberal tag. For example, the Prime Minister of UK, David Cameron, in 2011, claimed that we are talking about the enemy of enterprises, including the town hall officials who take forever with those planning decisions that can be make or break for our business. It's very difficult to explain to our Chinese students about planning, because in UK, when you want to promote economic growth, you have to streamline planning. In China, when the new mayor was appointed, the first thing he or she would do is to make more plans. So, researchers observed that in China, planning has experienced the third spring. Planning is a phoenix rising out of ashes. So why planning has become such a boom business in China? I would like to offer 3 explanations. The first explanation is that planning does adapt well to the market orientation. Because remember, in the Central and Eastern European countries, after shock therapy, planning profession became disoriented. But in this case, planning adapt well. Second explanation is planning is used to solve the problem created by market transition. Market transition created a lot of problems. Planning became a tool to deal with them. But there is a third explanation, which is more interesting. Planning actually helps to facilitate growth, and by doing so, legitimize the state power. So I would like to go through the whole planning history in order to understand these three explanations. First of all, China has a really long history of planning, but it's not that kind of planning I'm going to talk about. China's first planning rules was recorded in Book of Rules, or 考工记. They specify how you would need to build your cities. But in reality, when you actually build cities, you need to adapt to local context. For example, feng shui. When you choose your house location, you need face the south, near the water, a river, and back from the north wind. So is the way of choosing the city, the location of a city. So in the actual building of cities, for example, like this city wall of Shanghai, you will see a particular feature, a morphology of so-called the walled city. But really, planning as a modern building regulation or building codes started from the semi-colonial era when Shanghai, for example, became the colonial city. That's the city. You can see the wall city, then you see French concession area and international settlements. And in the French concession area, you see strict building codes and infrastructure building and road engineering. And in some places like Qingdao, it's under colonial rule, you see a very interesting building style, like this German style in Qingdao. And in the 1920s, China began to think about building their cities. And for example, this is the new civic center proposed in Shanghai metropolitan plan, to unify the city structure, building the city halls, hospitals, and libraries. For example, this is an interesting adaptation of Chinese building style. This is City Hall. Unfortunately, the whole plan, civic center plan, did not materialize because of Japanese war, the occupation. But this is a legacy. And this is a library, and you can see the interesting combination of Chinese style and the Western building technology. I deliberately take a distance to take the photo because you can see that the condition of that building was really not that good. It was occupied by a school. And similarly, in the capital plan of Nanjing, a new central administrative zone was proposed, but it didn't materialize because of political fraction between Sun Ce and Chiang Kai-shek. And it didn't materialize, and because of war. So planning really started as a modernization effort, learning from the West, but failed. Interestingly, when China came to 1949, a new China was built. We saw socialist regime. Interestingly, the modernization thrust continued, but in a strange way. So I would like to emphasize a lot of continuity instead of transition. But there's change, but in terms of emphasizing the production capacity. You have strong state capacity, and industrialization became very important, but with constrained urbanization. At the national level, you will see a great capacity, a deliberate redistribution of production forces. For example, locating key state projects in the central area. And to such extent, in the 60s, because of the Cold War, there was a deliberate act to create so-called the third frontier, i.e. the central and middle China, in order to avoid the damage in the war period. At the city level, you see the creation of industrial residential complex. For example, this is outskirt of Beijing, outside the central area. Combination of industrial factory area with workers' villages. And in Shanghai, you see the development of so-called workers' village. This is a Chaoyang New Village, started immediately after 1949, and it lasted about 3 decades just before the economic reform in the late 70s. This is Chaoyang New District. It was quite actually decent places. And China also learned Soviet kind of planning model of super blocks, and this was super block near the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development. Unfortunately, it is under demolition in this year, but it was used for central living quarter for the central government. And you see the politicization of urban space, also called socialist splendor, to demonstrate the superiority of the socialism over capitalism. Planning is important, and you can see the Stalin style of monumental buildings. Workers tried very hard to uplift the Red Star to the top of the building at that time. It was very difficult. But for most of urban areas, it was left untouched, like the courtyard housing area. Of course, this looks nice, but this is actually a replica of courtyard housing near Tiananmen Square. This is an entrance. Of course, it's quite controversial because people said it actually destroyed Hutong spirit. But the question is, can socialists plan the city? If you believe the socialist city was powerful enough to plan everything, that would be entirely wrong. Socialist city could not actually provide comprehensive coordination. The role of physical planner was actually quite peripheral, because the reason is that there was no development control mechanism. If you think John Freeman's description about planning as in public domain, in China, planning is really in the state domain. And the land uses within individual work units was left to the decision of work units themselves. And state can only regulate so-called residual area. And only after economic reform, planning became a popular subject. And this shows the proliferation of the urban planning undergrad programs. When we started in the early 90s, when I started university education, urban planning and biotech and computer science were among the 3 top measures that require highest university entrance scores. And since then, you can see that it became a popular subject. I think I chose the wrong subject here. Planning plays a very important position, as shown in this planning exhibition hall in Shanghai. And our new leader, Xi Jinping, started his inspection of Beijing city from Beijing Exhibition Hall. And in this planning hall, you see a gigantic model is displaced. And in fact, through commodification of planning became a very profitable business, and university professors actually made a bit more money from doing that. You see that a cluster of this printing model making firms near the campus of Tongji University, where planning is very important. And through, as Professor Jaglos mentioned at the beginning, through this tax reform and the economic devolution and incentivizing a local government, and local government became entrepreneurial agents. For example, just outside Shanghai, you see a county-level city, Kunshan, initially built illegally a development zone. Because it did so well, it gained national recognition. And that worried Shanghai, because Shanghai wanted to attract investment as well. So Shanghai invented a project called 173 project to fight Kunshan, because Shanghai will lease 173 cheap land to attract investment. To counter the competition, Kunshan designated a new industrial zone circulated Shanghai. So you can see it became a kind of a battlefield. And interestingly, in the 2000s, when Kunshan began to prepare its master plan, it invited a Taiwanese architecture firm to design the place. And interestingly, at that time, Kunshan was very compact, and together with its economic development zone. And the Taiwanese model was to really divide into different zones or functional zones in order to prevent urban sprawl in the future. Interestingly, the local government inherited that kind of plan by extending the plan into the whole area. So it's actually it actually contradicted the original plan spirit when I look in detail. And it amazingly, when Kunshan began to revise its strategic plan or urban master plan in 2008, it came up a very simplistic but astonishingly true picture like this. You basically divided 3 zones. The whole area, the central area, will be the same zone of the big city. But actually, when you travel by car from this point to the core area, it takes almost an hour. So this is more than a city. It's really a big, gigantic area. And another example is Zhengzhou. The city government ambitiously developed its new town, but actually not new town, it's new CBD. Asked the famous Japanese designer, create artificial lake and with a circular of office buildings. And you can see that's the Zhengzhou city proper, and that's the new development, new district. But what is more ambitiously, Zhengzhou wanted to develop a new city in between Kaifeng and Zhengzhou called Zhenbian New District, and asked consultants to prepare major visionary future plans. And interestingly, Arab proposed a plan of eco-development in between this. But remember, this is really a vast rural area between, if you look at the scale, 80 kilometers between this area. So, planning is really adapted well, facilitated development. But now I come to the second explanation. Because of this market reform orientation, create this urban expansion, create a lot of problems. For example, land encroachment and water pollution. This is in southern Shantong. The river was really heavily polluted. And so the central government had always wanted to maintain certain control. So planning has been taken as a new way to combat the chaotic development. For example, the Chinese Academy of Urban Planning and Design created so-called urban system plan, national urban system plan. However, it was not adopted in a way because it contradicted the trend at that time. It is urban economic devolution. And also, it has a problem with NDRC because NDRC has its own interest to develop another set of spatial plan, which is shown in Professor Lee's earlier presentation about clusters. So you can see the confrontation between different departments. At the regional level, in the River Delta, urban cluster plan has been created in order to prevent further urban sprawl, concentrated the development in the main axes. The NDRC proposed Yangtze River Delta regional plan is also trying to create a new structure, a more orderly structure in China. So you can see that planning has been used in that way to combat problematic competition between different cities and to make more coordinated development. But very interestingly, now I come to the third explanation. When the central government tried to constrain the development or create a more orderly development, local government has innovatively use planning to open up a new space for development. For example, in this case, it's a new town in Wuxi. And put that new town in the context, it is built in southern Jiangsu, this kind of water landscape area. So that's the new town. That's the earlier, before the new town was built, that was a landscape. And in that new town, it interestingly designated a place to be the eco-city. That is a Swedish Wuxi eco-city. But the strength of that new town project is interesting because it actually created some additional kind of tertiary industries. For example, this studio, Wuxi Studio, as a creative industry base, actually provided some basis for jobs. But not all eco-cities are successful. For example, the Arab's vision, when it talked to or employed by Shanghai Industry Corporation, Investment Corporation, to plan Dongtan, it created a new vision like this, and also adapted it into a Chinese urbanism. But unfortunately, it has not been materialized because of, I think, not understanding the Chinese planning system broadly, and also because of this problem of previous mayor corruption case, the arrest of Mayor Chen Liangyu afterwards, and the project has been abandoned. So you can see that planning has really transformed a lot from the pre-reform period as a physical design to a more kind of an instrument to promote economic growth as a development declaration and to brand the place. And interestingly, when Chinese planner, the former senior planner of CAUPD, Chinese Academy of Urban Regional Plan and Design, and now the director of Xiamen Planning Bureau, he advised planners that you need to look after your jobs because there's a competition between different professions. He said, the role of planners is to lobby the local government and sell professional knowledge to those cities that wish to adopt its advice. The purpose is to help the client, remember client, to defeat other city competitors. This is now the new professional ethics of planners. So I literally translate word by word. And you can see that in his earlier famous design to advise Guangzhou to compete with other places. Planning also become more market efficient through contract, through design competition, and adopt a rationality. And also, Chinese planners are very interested in foreign examples, overseas examples, through interreferencing. For example, in the southern area of Nanjing, a new rural town has been branded. Rural village has been remodeled to attract foreign to attract visitors over the weekends as a kind of rural tourism. Claimed that it followed the slow city model, or città slow, in Italy, and invited the vice president to the place to endorse it, and the vice president said, "Oh, that's perfect. That really is the slow city. So endorse it as the first slow city in China." But sadly, the vice president, when he returned to Italy, the politician was killed by mafia 2 months later after his China trip. So in Tianjin, in this eco-city, you see the adoption of new technologies, solar panels, for example. Behind that, you also see a very interesting estate. The estate is called British Land, selling the properties to those who are interested in a more good life, if you think that way. So real estate development is part of the driver of so-called eco-city movement. So my question is, you see there are a lot of activities seem to suit the market. But the question is, really planning is for the market? I don't think so. Planning for growth is not equivalent to the planning for the market, because the market actually doesn't really require this particular form of development. Planning really, in a post-reform period, strengthened the state role in the planning, in development, and as indicated by this another monumental building. This is a district government of Yuhua district of Nanjing, building into another, not a socialist monumentalism, but post-socialist monumentalism, but something continuous. And through legitimized growth, it also strengthens the role of the state. For example, the demolition of villages in Shanghai to create this new high-tech park, CUHK high-tech park. And interestingly, yes, that's good. When I went to China to take more photos for this book, I went to see the new civic center proposed in the 1929. And that was the stadium built at that time. So I took photos, but I was stopped by a security guard. He said, "You are not allowed to take photos," but I didn't expect that would be the case, because I think it's a public building. Then I realized that I entered a territory of a new so-called development built by a Hong Kong developer, Xuan Group, who famously built Shanghai's Xintiandi. I've written an article about Xintiandi, so if you're interested, you can look at that article. And what you see is, in this one, is the Chuangzhitiandi is so-called ecological, it's innovation and community combined with this new trendy buildings, highly secured. That really reminds me the Canary Wharf in London, and it's a public space, but it is a private corporate space. So, China's planners' vision to create a new civic center has not been materialized until now in a very strange way. But the problem is we need to think more about that. Planning for growth in China, what should we think about future planning? Really, we should need goals beyond the market technocratic rationality to think about the politics of development. Planning is for social justice. To that end, I'll use this presentation to commemorate Professor Sir Peter Ho, as Professor Lee mentioned about his book, Good Life, Good City and Better Life. Among his many publications, there's a book called Urban and Regional Planning. Originally, my intention is to write a book of urban regional planning in China. That's the subtitle of my book. And I asked Professor Ho to endorse my book in this May. He said he was delighted, but unfortunately he passed away 2 months later. And he was a Bartlett Professor of Planning. And I think I use that to memorize this great scholar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to having this slide here and remembering also to us that the profession of planners has to do also with civic commitment. And of course, on the other hand, being involved in planning issue in a context like China means, of course, to face some of the issues that Professor Wu mentioned very clearly. So it's not an easy task, but I would like now to open the floor for the question, because I think there's a lot of question coming from the floors. Please. One there.
Thank you, Professor Wu. My question is about the role of the urban planners in China's social transition. It's very interesting you quote the opinion about the planner about the new ethics. What do you think about the new ethics of the Chinese urban planners? Who do you think they are loyal to? Are they loyal to the Communist Party? Are they loyal to the government? Are they loyal to their profession? Are they loyal to the people? Thank you.
I think that's a big question, and that question should be raised towards Chinese planners and for them to think profoundly. I think the major challenge for Chinese planners and Chinese urban researchers is that is a commodification of their profession in a way that they, for example, the Planning Design Institute has been transformed from a government agency to a firm that you need to take design jobs and planning design jobs in order to generate profit, in order to sustain. So that's a major challenge. I think in that aspect, the planning association or the Chinese Planners Society should play a greater role as an intermediate organization. But currently, it's also difficult because it's funded by the government. And also, it has a very close relation with the government. But I think it's not necessarily a bad thing because that means you can influence the government's decision in one way or another. But I think at the moment, I don't have a ready answer for that. I know what should be answered, but it's for Chinese planners to understand that. I think a key issue is probably Professor Ng will talk about the right to city. That is a very important issue.
One question there.
My question is, you say that the role of planning is to serve social justice. How does planning profession in China needs to change in order to take up the challenge of fighting for social justice? Because obviously you cannot fight social justice by just pronouncing that we are for social justice.
That's right. I think there's important for further research. That is, you need really more independent research rather than a consultancy report for the government. That's the important issue, I think, in terms of research impact. And my short answer probably is like that. Yeah.
If there are no other...
And probably institutionally, you also need to set up the what's called a town planning board as a kind of independent or quasi-independent organization to review planning decisions. But it's difficult. Although in Shenzhen and Guangzhou, there are some similar organizations, but the government has a way to appoint those who support the view, or you have multiple versions, then government can pick up one or two versions or synthesize multiple versions into the one that suits them most.
One question there. Yeah.
Thanks. The combination of planning for growth, state socialism, rich ghetto communities, and lack of participation in China's urban planning, like we heard yesterday, makes me ask you, do you think in 2050 Chinese cities will be reflections of urban utopias or dystopias? Thanks.
I think that's a profound question. That is, it will change a lot to 2050. I think there will be a rising society. If you look at the so-called middle-class estate, housing estates, gated communities, and they have a very strong role of homeowners associations, a greater awareness of rights based on their property interests. But on the other hand, I think you shouldn't give too much hope to property-based political mobilization, because at the end of the day, it's also about a particular section of population. It might not include, for example, rural migrants in the cities. And in the long term, I think it depends upon the more bottom-up activities through building a community of their own and made their voice heard.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the organizer to invite me to share my little knowledge here. I enjoyed the conference very much. I'm no futurist. I don't have the whole national strategy to share with you. I don't have thousands of history of planning in China to share with you. I have a very humble objective. I just want to bring everyone back to the human scale. And I would like to talk about human flourishing and the production of space. And I want to start with my personal story. Hong Kong in the 1960s, when I was born, you probably could recognize that's me when I was a baby. Hong Kong at that time was like this. And then, of course, the family grew. And I lived in a squatter area. If you don't really recognize this area, you probably know the infamous Kowloon Walled City. I didn't live in the walled city, but lived in its outskirts. I lived in the squatter area, and so were many Hong Kongers at that time. Well, a lot of families lived in these shared apartments. I remember when I was really small, my family lived in one of those double-deck, bed. Many people did share that kind of living environment. I didn't study in a rooftop school, but many of my friends did. We suffered from water shortage 4 hours a day, so that's why people were lining up to go to the public water tap for water. Life was hard. Most of our parents were working, so the bigger ones would take care of the smaller ones, but somehow we still enjoyed life. And, we'll just get by and still resilient until 1966. The Star Ferry raised a 5 cents of its fare, and that led to hunger strike by people who were fed up with a society according to what Richard Hills in his Borrowed Time, Borrowed Space said. Life is very hard and cruel for many in Hong Kong at that time, and there are gross extremes of wealth and poverty. And the following slides will be quite familiar given what's happening in Hong Kong. Riots and anti-riots police actions. And at that time, of course, the riots, was reinforced by the Cultural Revolution in China, and you could see that people were raising this little red book in front of the governor's house at that time, protesting. And I think, in a sense, the riots were a wake-up call to the British colonial government at that time. And after that, they started to build the new towns, improve the living conditions of the colonized. And that started a new page of spatial development in Hong Kong. And that's how Hong Kong is today. Of course, Hong Kong has changed a lot, and it's really a stunning and beautiful city. We continue to live in very high-density environments, high-rise, very compact. Well, we tolerated this kind of open space under flyovers, flyovers that really fly through, high-rise buildings. You could almost shake hands with the drivers if you happened to live in one of those buildings. We tolerated high-rise buildings building along the waterfronts, blocking wind and sometimes even sunshine of the old city. We tolerated very narrow sidewalks, very little green areas in the old urban areas. About 200,000 of our population lived in this kind of accommodation. Very, very congested, tiny space. If you look at the population density of our city, the average looks okay, of course not by European standard, by Asian standard, the average is about like 6,600 per square kilometers. But if you look at places like Kowloon, if you happen to know place names in Hong Kong, that's outrageously dense. Gradually, people started to question this kind of tolerance. So when redevelopment set in, people question why this bulldozing of our community? Why this bulldozing of a vibrant local economy, of a street? So these streets were being redeveloped into these very high-rise buildings that no one could afford, not even a professor like me. Into urban forum, which doesn't really speak to the street markets next door, into gated communities. In the rural areas, urban expansions expanded to the rural areas. Bulldozing, trying to bulldoze this kind of settlements, and that's the plan, to build all these high-rise buildings. It's okay if it's just high-rise buildings for like the poor and for public housing, but people did research and noticed that a lot of the developers, or even including government officials or legislators, they actually have the land bank in these places. And that kind of development would just benefit them even more. Worse still, they drove out the farmers, they fence off the land, and they wait for the development opportunities. And that's why people protested. So Hong Kong is a protesting city. I don't know whether you know about it. Every year on the 1st of July, we celebrated our return to China by a protest as well. And there are lots of reasons for us to do so. And don't belittle this kind of protest. Even this grandmother, she sat in a store and trying to have her voice heard when the government wanted to bulldoze this little village to build a high-speed rail. If you look at these slogans for the protest, it's about power to the people, it's complaining about the government's biased policy, it's asking the government to improve people's livelihood, it's a protest against social polarization again. So why do I talk about this? I think there is a certain level of similarity in the current protest and the one in the 1960s. On the surface, right? Like on the surface in the 1960s is the fair increase of Star Ferry, but underlying is the social polarization. This time, the surface is this political democratic, reform. That the basic law in Hong Kong, the mini Constitution in Hong Kong promises us to have universal suffrage by year 2017. However, recently, the National People's Congress, the Standing Committee said, our universal suffrage would be like this. We'll have a nomination committee of 1,200 people. They will select for us 2 candidates. After that, we'll have 1 man, 1 vote. And that brought people to the streets. Especially, we well understand that in a banned book in China, which is called The Pioneering Voices of History by the Communist Party, that's what they said back in the 1940s. The critical step towards democracy is to end one-party rule. Another saying is, a democratic country should entrust its power in people's hands. So, the underlying reason for so many people are on the streets today has to do with the name of this very popular book, one of the bestsellers. It's called Land and the Ruling Class. It actually tells us who are the ruling class in our society and how these big developers, these tycoons, are actually controlling our economy. So I have not verified this data, but this person trying to look at the top 10 developers, how much they earn, and then try to see how much we per capita, is contributing to their profit. So the recent events, I guess, most of you have seen in the newspaper. A lot of people go to the street. Our umbrella movement, try not to antagonize the central government. It's not really a revolution. But the police response to the movement, to the protest, has brought more people to the streets. So these are some of the familiar images. The people we don't have enough open space in our city. People are using the streets as our open space, public space, to sort of like protest against all these biased policies, these policies that privilege some against, the majority. So I want to set, the discussion about the rights to human flourishing with my personal story, or the story of Hong Kong, and talk about what are these rights to human flourishing, how can we move forward with reference to our city's development. Now, what are rights? According to, Hoffeld, he divided rights into active rights and passive rights. For active rights are more like, rights that we can control, the rights of the owner. And he divided it into privilege rights and power rights. Like if I own this computer, I have the privilege of owning it, using it. So I have the power to say, okay, I'm going to lend it to Olivia, I'm going to sell it to someone. By owning this computer, I also have passive rights. Passive rights further are divided into positive rights and negative rights. This positive rights is claim rights. I claim this ownership. I've got this property right. Immunity rights is like, because I own it, I'm immune from someone messing with it. You are not allowed to mess with my computer. It's mine. So, rights and human flourishing. In Chinese culture, if you got my story about the history of Hong Kong, what I can understand is that as Chinese, we are quite good in the privilege and the power sets of rights, because in our culture, we always encourage people to be better, to be more excellent, to transcend yourself. However, we're not very good in fighting for claims rights or immunity rights. These are not written in our culture. So very often it's like until we really cannot tolerate, and then something, happens. However, if you look at, if we look at human flourishing in a sense is quite a Western concept. Because for us, it's always like you need to improve yourself. And it's this self-transcendence that's always, with us in our culture. But if we look at human flourishing as a more generic concept, it's about satisfying our desires that will lead to successful human living. And you can do it. Chinese are very good in doing it in terms of like using our own resources, our intelligence, and whatever it means to feel good. However, we forget that sometimes we have to think about like this kind of subjective self-advancement need to be protected in a socioeconomic context. Or what Lisbon tried to argue, there are actually two levels of capabilities of human flourishing. The first one is, it's really the more self-initiated one, right? That we have to be our own self in order to fight for this right to human flourishing. And there's also another level which requires a more objective, nurturing environment. And as I've said, in our Chinese culture, we handle the first level very well. But then the second level requires a certain amount of social and spatial justice for that human flourishing to take place. And that is something that we are not doing very well. not very well in Hong Kong, and definitely from what we just heard, not very well in China as well. So in other words, if we take this ecological approach of understanding personal growth, being embedded in families, in our schools, and in a larger system of neighborhood, of work environment, and yet a larger system of culture, laws, rules, and regulations, we need to understand that it's not just one person trying very hard, it's also the environment which affects it. And I think from the keynotes yesterday, it's very clear that we need that environment to achieve human flourishing as well. So if we look at that like this, and I want to kind of like really very quickly to go through what my understanding of the rights to human flourishing is by combining these different ways of looking at it. There will be three levels. The first will be the individual level, our physical and mental health, and then resilient families and sustainable communities. So when we talk about the right to physical and mental health, we're talking about how we can, be ourselves, able to love, to think, to reflect, to really connect, so to have the power to extend ourselves, to connect. But at the same time, we also need that passive rights, the claim rights, and the immunity rights. The claim rights is like, we need to at least be satisfied with our basic needs, a nice environment, nurturing environment to be able to enjoy and recreate ourselves. We also need to be free from oppression of all kinds. I really like, Iris May Young's 5 Phases of Oppression, that we need to be free from exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. Similarly, our right to resilient families include, of course, we can try to be very resilient within the family, looking at the strength of our family members, build on that resilience to turn whatever adversity into growth opportunities. But at the same time, the families need to have that claim to a stable environment for the family to grow, to develop, to have family-friendly environments, amenities, to be able to have job security so that the family can be sustained, that people will not be discriminated because of their family positions. And the right to sustainable community includes its right to social networking, accumulate social capital, to protect local economic development, to conserve local culture, and this claim to placemaking and the right to develop sustainable communities, and this immunity rights not to be controlled and not to be demolished or displaced by force. And that reminds me of the very sad movie that we watched yesterday. So what's the implication for the production of space if we have to acknowledge the right to human flourishing? Well, according to the Wildflower Institute, who did research in the States and also China, has a very interesting set of graphs I would like to share with you. Before modernization or capitalist development or whatever you call it, the traditional culture is really more collegial, collaborative, and very community-based. We use more of our spaces for activities to sustain our communities. But as we move to urbanization, modernization, industrialization, or these globalization processes, more spaces became used for that end. So what should we do with reference to spatial production? It's really to, rebalance this biased allocation of land and spaces for wealth creation back to a more balanced way of allocating spaces. That we don't just have places for wealth creation, for public facilities that support wealth creation. We need spaces for people to grow, to replenish as well. So if that's the case, then how can we plan future Chinese cities? I think in Hong Kong or in many Chinese cities, we've been developing for growth for a long time. But I would like to quote from Henry Lefebvre and many other scholars who try to remind us the real wealth of us when we use space is to use space so that we can use the places and the spaces to actualize our potentialities, and in that process, we'll grow ourselves, we will also benefit others. And unless we do that, we are not really creating real wealth. And I think that is very important to remind ourselves. So when we plan cities, we need to really provide spaces for people to relax, to reflect, so that they really can think and feel the existence, the here and now, so that they can re-perceive what are the real issues, what are the real options, so that they know that they have the claim right, the right to shelter, the right to open space, the right to replenishing spaces, the right to personal growth spaces, and have that immunity rights not to be marginalized, not to be exploited, not to be brainwashed, not to be powerless, and not to be violently treated. The same for the nurturing of resilient families. This privilege to have families, development, growth, developing a trusting relationship. I want to cite from Morse, and she said, nurturing ground. Family is our nurturing ground to learn to trust, to cooperate, and to develop our self-restraint. It's the first place for us to learn about self-governance. And this power to turn adversity into growth opportunities. And that, also need the claim rights to really, allow community to provide support for family development. And this immunity right to have job security, to have no discrimination. And similarly, these spaces for sustainable community, the privilege to develop ourselves, our community, based on our access to have this power to self-empowerment, endowing spaces with our stories, our activities, the claim rights to really have public spaces for the citizens, so that these spaces are for the wider, public. And the immunity rights, the right to say no, to be controlled, to be displaced or dislocated by force. All right, I understand my time is up. I don't really need 5 minutes. I think Chinese culture, people in Chinese culture, or like my upbringing, we've been very resilient in terms of like always trying to do better, whatever the circumstances. But I guess if we look in the future, we probably cannot sustain that kind of culture without realizing that social and spatial justice is very important for human flourishing as well. You can't ask your people to always just do self-transcendence, and then, the whole environment is corrupt and also bankrupt and not really, doing any justice to the mass majority. So in a sense, a rebalancing, a reframing, and a refocusing of the way that we organize our spaces is very important to redress the production of space for markets, for exchange values only. Because that is debasing to human dignity, it's not really working for families. It's weakening the family bonds. It breaks up community. It's not building any community. Well, would that such rebalancing be squaring circles? Probably yes. But, well, squares or circles, I don't really care. I think, we just need that kind of spaces that might not be, very neat and tidy. It might be a little bit uncertain, maybe a little bit chaotic. But I think that kind of spaces which can really unleash our potential as human beings so that we can, develop more resilience among family members and develop more sustainable communities will certainly be more fun, more convivial, more different, and more alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very inspirational presentation. And before there was initially a sort of tension between China and Hong Kong, and now it's becoming clear that is more sort of universal tension between the space as a reproduction of mechanism of accumulation and exploitation on one side, planning for growth, and on the other side, what does it mean, the space as a reproduction of capabilities for people in a way. So with this reflection, I would like to open the floor for some questions. There are 3 questions. Let's start from there first, probably easier. Yeah.
Simone Turmello, University of Lisbon. Thank you very much for an amazing presentation. I'm really impressed by this framework you presented. Still, I was thinking about Chantal Mouffe's debates about agonism in international relations. And I was wondering if you can develop a bit on how this kind of framework is deeply based in Western conceptions of rights and in a Western conception of justice. And I can imagine that in different cultures, such as one culture I don't really know, which is the Chinese one, there may be some trouble in trying to translate in this kind of approach. And I'm curious and asking you, can develop a bit on that, please.
Thank you for your question. Well, you have to appreciate that I'm a Hong Konger. So Hong Kong, you know, I'm made in Hong Kong, basically. So we are a city of East and West, old and new. I'm very eclectic. Sometimes, well, okay, there are certain things which are really very Western and we can really tell. But when it comes to justice, basic human rights, rule of law, we see it as like a common human heritage more than just something Western. I don't think that should just be the privilege of the Westerners. It should be something that human beings all share, because we understand that, like in America, not too long ago, they still have slaves. We all had slaves, right? And we believe that some people were born slaves and they should not have the same rights. The civic movements in the States, they were not too long ago as well. So I guess it's this collective body which is called human beings. We learned all this, and I don't think something is just deeply, you know, Western and not applicable to our context, especially in the context of Hong Kong, when people have been exposed to all these ideas and concepts for so long that we probably won't buy that is something, you know, for the Westerners, and that we have no share in it. I'm not sure I have answered your question, but that's how I look at it. We might guard our Chinese roots very, you know, jealously, but at the same time, we're very greedy. We think that some of the Western things are also ours.
There are 3 things which stand out from Hong Kong, looking at afar: high-rise buildings, high-density settlements, and government ownership of land. It came to me as a surprise that the biggest private fortunes in Hong Kong are made through land. So I was always, and that's something you also share with, on the other side of the border with China. So what I would like to ask you, what China can learn from Hong Kong's experience? Because China needs high-density settlement. Has Hong Kong succeeded in creating a feeling of neighborliness in high-rise buildings? Similarly, question of social justice, how can it be reconciled? Or government ownership of land can be used to serve that purpose?
Thank you, Professor Hussain. I have to say I dare not tell the central government what to do. It's a bit risky. But I think maybe I can share what Hong Kong has been doing. I remember when I did my PhD at UCLA under Professor John Friedman. If people know John Friedman, you know that he's talking about community empowerment all the time. So when I went back to Hong Kong and talked about community empowerment, people thought I came back from Mars. Because at that time it's growth and growth and growth, right? We built our 10 core airport projects in 8 years' time, within 10 years. 10 core projects, reclaiming land, building our airport express, highways, the whole new town, less than 10 years. It's a period when it's just like in China, this reckless growth that people thought I was crazy, talking about what you're talking about, community participation. Even the people thought I was crazy because they were living in very poor conditions and subdivided flats. So they welcomed development. Development was good to them. But I think the problem is that it's at a time when people look at this kind of development, yes, up to a point, people benefited in this growth and growth and growth mentality. Up to a point when they started to feel like, wait a minute, what are we doing? We're breaking up communities. We're living in a city of strangers. We no longer feel that bonding with our family members because everyone is working so hard for no reason. And that kind of like, and then people look at the government's policy, especially after our return to Chinese rule, that I think the central government really feared the capitalists would leave Hong Kong, and so they blessed all the policies which are sort of like biased towards the interests of the capitalists. And it started to backfire, this kind of growth and growth mentality, and people started to question. So what we've been doing is really to do more community education on one hand, and also believe that there are lots of good people inside the government. If the community voices are louder, they can do more work. Otherwise, they would be overshadowed by the more powerful bureaucrats. So I believe there are good people everywhere, and whatever position, you can do something if you have a heart. I think China will change as well when people have more education. I think history shows that. Maybe it's not the time yet, but I think eventually it will, because it's just human nature, I think. At least that's how we are experiencing in Hong Kong, because Hong Kongers are very famous for our thirst for money and profit-making endeavors. But it has changed, obviously. And I think it's just human nature that eventually people realize what is the real wealth in our life. And it's not money, for sure.